19th century, they fled Polish Silesia, escaping poverty, war, and a profound sense of hopelessness. They placed their trust in a priest who promised them a new beginning. They believed Texas would offer freedom, a plot of land and fresh opportunity. The first winter claimed many lives. The land was dry, the language unfamiliar, the neighbors often hostile, and yet they lasted out. They built a church, a school, and a new life, a piece of Poland passed on to the Texas prairie. Today, more than 150 years later, their descendants still honor those early pioneers. What have they inherited from their ancestors? And what does it mean to be a Polish settler in the heart of Texas?
You know, you had a very difficult economic time for the Silesian people that ended up in Panna Maria, Texas. And the reason why they came here, I think a lot of people really have scratched the surface of it and they don't really understand it. And I think some of this is really told by the different stories of my family's history and the different sides of my family, from the Snogas to the Opielas, right to the Yaskos. And with the floods of 1854, you had two societies, right? You had the tenant farmers who were reliant on their crops. And when those crops failed, they were in a difficult situation. They had a person from their community that had gone, a forebearer that had gone before to this place called Texas. Because it was Texas, it was not America that they went to. Because Father Leopold Muchigamba, who was the Franciscan friar who had been sent by the Vatican to minister to the German-speaking peoples of the hill country of Texas, in an era that was both right before and shortly after Texas becoming part of the United States. So Texas was very much not America in this period of time. And he rode the horseback circuit from Fredericksburg to Castroville to New Braunfels and wrote these letters home and glorified Texas in a way that really set these people with a hope for something new. He misrepresented, to a large extent, the realities of life, okay?
Father Leopold was a Bavarian priest from Poland, and there was a request from the Archbishop at the time, who took care of all of Texas, for a priest to try to administer to the German Catholics that were already here. They wanted priests for that. And so Father Leopold, was assigned to Castroville. And Castroville, as a German community, was already prospering. And the farmers were already doing all their farming industry had started. And he saw how that was happening and they were prospering. So he starts writing to his brothers and his 4 brothers. And he's saying, there's abundant land here to do your farming. There's freedom of religion here. You can make yourself to whatever you want to be here. Well, then they started wanting to do this because he kept writing about how good it was. So they sold all their properties, sold all their goods, and took off on this dream of success within the United States and prosperity and freedom from what they were going through there.
But it was not this searching for the American dream that people see going to Ellis Island, you know, the traditional story that people most of the immigrant communities that have come to America experienced in the later part of the 1800s. This was a fundamentally different experience for a couple of reasons. First of all, they had economic challenges. That's why ultimately they uprooted and came in 1854, because to a large extent they had no other choice.
In mid-September of 1854, the first group of immigrants set out traveling through Wrocław and Berlin on their way to the port city of Bremen. 9 weeks later, a ship named the Weser had arrived in Texas, carrying 304 passengers on board. These settlers had reached Texas, a state more than twice the size of present-day Poland, with fewer than 50,000 white settlers living there at that time. Officials registered nearly 100 Polish families, bearing names like Mocygimba, Pawelek, Opiela, and Kielbasa.
The stories I've been told, because they are stories, is that Peter came over in the first migration of immigrants from Silesia in 1854. I believe he left for economic reasons. I think they wanted I think there was a difficult economic period in Poland at the time, and they were looking for a better way of life. And so they landed in a coastal town called Indianola, and then walked essentially about 70 miles to Panna Maria, which is the city that the village that they founded with Father Leopold Mocygimba.
After 8-9 weeks on board a freighter, it wasn't a passenger ship. In the bottom hull is where they were, sleeping in like bunk beds, 3 or 4. All these families, there's about 800 people that left and started to come here. So they had to walk sold everything, left families behind, grandparents, friends, walked to Bremen, got on the ship in Bremen, Germany, and then they came to Indianola. They get to Indianola and they're supposed to meet Father Leopold there. He wasn't there. So then they had to walk to Galveston. They told him go to Galveston. So that's where they went. He wasn't there. So they started the trek to San Antonio. Well, by then, people started dying from diseases. Some of them couldn't get past Galveston. And so fewer and fewer people were coming towards Panna Maria. And for the first time, they were encountering rattlesnakes. They were encountering thorn bushes. They were encountering what we call poxiva. It's a bull nettle, and it burns you, makes you itch and burn. If they did not have enough funds, they had to carry their trunk. So basically, they were going from Galveston to San Antonio. They get to San Antonio, and Father Leopold says, hey, we gotta keep going. So they're walking almost 3 weeks, 217 miles, carrying their belongings, carrying their babes in their arms. And they get here, and there's absolutely nothing but brush. And so they had to go ahead and dig out holes in the mud in that, because we're talking December. This is Texas, the weather's a little different. December is cold, but it continues to get colder in January and February. And so all they had for protection was cutting the grass and cutting the limbs and digging holes to cover themselves for protection.
In dugouts. You know, they had no structures. And so they dug holes in the ground. And you know, you got to look at what they got here on the basis of these letters written from Father Leopold that said this is the land flowing with milk and honey. But it was the land of prickly pear and rattlesnakes. He totally misrepresented it to them. And what happened was they then, you know the story too about how they almost tried to hang the guy. because he put them in a situation that they went from the frying pan to the fire in a way that they did not really expect coming to Texas. And to this day, we have this perception in Europe of Texas as this cowboys in it. I still get this from people, and it's fascinating to me.
My great-great-great-grandpa, Jan Dugas, he had a gun, he had a rifle, okay? And what they did in the early days when they came in the 1860s, they actually had to register your gun, and you were part of the frontiersmen. My great-great-grandpa, Jan Dugas, was a frontiersman, okay? And later on, the governor of Texas declared them all Texas Rangers. So I am a blood descendant of a Texas Ranger. I can wear the Texas Ranger badge. When the first settlers came over, there was really no law, okay? Your closest law was San Antonio, and so what they did, they probably elected a sheriff way back there, but everybody was a frontiersman, so we had to all stick together. So what they did is that they've got the list of them, I have the list, anyway, but they wrote it down as to who you were, and your birthday, so they knew how old you were, and what guns you had. And so no communication was, if they had an Indian raid and they were headed out south, they stopped and got Mr. Dugas, okay? Stopped what he was doing and said, hey, John, get your gun, man. There's got some Apaches over here that stole some horses, okay? Or they kidnapped somebody. We got to go get them. So you dropped your deal and you take care of it. If you weren't Polish, you were bad. No, there was definitely good guys and bad guys. And like I say, we had some law and order. It was a crazy time. There were a lot of killings, and people were shot, people were hanged. That was the way it was back then. That's the way it was. You had the law of the Old West. You had to be tough. You can imagine when they came over from Poland, they came here to look around and say, "Holy smoly, this ain't where's the milk and honey?" It was tough. I got to hand it to them. It was tough, but they scratched a living, and here I am.
They stopped on a small hill near a river, in the middle of an empty prairie covered in grass and shrubs. Oak trees grew here and there, but there were no signs of any settlement. They could ride in any direction and see nothing but endless prairie. They set up a cross and unpacked their belongings, feather beds, plows, and harrows. They named their first settlement Panna Maria.
So they get here on what is basically Christmas Eve with Father Leopold. And they have, under the oak tree that's in our churchyard, they have their first Mass of Thanksgiving there. And that's basically where they lived until they could acquire their own property, because Father Leopold only bought property for the church itself. And then they had to negotiate with John Tohig, who was one of the richest men in Texas at the time, who owned this property to buy land and whatever.
When they got to Panna Maria, they realized that the plot of land that Father Machagimba had secured for them wasn't big enough for the whole group. And so a contingent of them left. I'm not sure how big it was, if it was half or a third, but a contingent of them left Texas and moved to Chicago. And that was the beginning of the Polish immigrants in Chicago.
They couldn't speak any English. And so they went through a lot of hard times. In fact, in those first few years at the beginning, if the butlers from Helena and the Indians and the Mexican people had not helped them, they probably would have starved. or moved away completely, because some of them, there was 13 families that couldn't find land here. So they wound up walking back to San Antonio and got a free ride to what is now Bandera. And they got a one-way drive there. And they established Bandera in February 1855. So we're talking 2 short months after they first came to America.
We settled Bandera, 1855. The Polish, there was 13 families, and they're all on the church. If you go look, the church will show you all the families that came. And we got 2. We got Anderwalds. My daddy's mother was an Anderwald, and my mother was a Laskuski, and then a Brzozowski, and then I don't, it just goes and goes. Yeah. And Dugash. My name was Dugash. And John Dugash came over, then there was Casper, and then there was Gabriel. Gabriel was my daddy's name, and then my grandmother was Anderwall. So we're all connected.
I'm number 12 of 13 kids, and so back in those days, we're kind of like the old Polish. We managed to do everything the way the old Polish did. So, you know, I think in Poland, a lot of times the kids were born at home. So I was born in the house that I live in. My dad delivered me. You know, I was number 12 of 13 kids. And I grew up, I had 3 brothers and I had 7 sisters. So it was great because we were like the old Polish. We lived off the land. We were just kind of like the heritage that was brought over from Poland. We managed to do, we had gardens, we canned, we preserved, back then there was a lot of wild game, so you could hunt, fish, and really we were what you would call poor, but we didn't know it, you know, because we had everything we needed. We didn't worry about anything, you know, and back then, it didn't take much money, you know, bread was cheap. We ground our own cornmeal. We made our own meal. We made our own bacon. You know, we had cows that we milked. You know, we were self-sustaining. If the world could have come to an end, we would have stayed alive.
They were skilled craftsmen, capable of building stone houses that still stand today. Structures built with the techniques they had brought from old Poland. Step by step, they were becoming part of America.
Once they got here, then the first building, the Goblicks, John Tohig went ahead and built the Snoga store, what is now the Snoga store. It became a place that they could go and sell, because John Tohig also sold them property so that they could use their grains and that to help to pay for their lands. So John Tohig had that building built, and he delivered grain, he delivered supplies there, and then the Polish people in turn were using that building. They were allowed to use it as their church, their school, and whatever, post office, whatever else they needed. It's been a working post office since 1856, and it became a way station between Goliad and San Antonio as well for the Pony Express. So Snoga store was the first permanent building here in Panna Maria. Then came the John Goblicks house, and as the first permanent residence here within the area. And then the church in the meantime was being built.
Panna Maria was the first settlement, but they lost their church. It actually was made of wood. And so Bandera, when they built it, and I've got to give them credit, because we refurbished the church, and it was 1/4 of an inch out of square. Wonderful craftsmanship from poles, and all of the beams were all pegged. It was beautiful work, and still beautiful today. And they had a Polish painter come in and actually painted it, and it's a beautiful painted church now. So it's really one of our we're very proud of it. My dad was a carpenter, but the generations of Poles that were here, we had a lot of stonemasons. So you see a lot of stonework in Bandera that the Poles did, like the school, the church. The State Stanislaus is actually the oldest standing church in the United States, Polish church.
It is an original house built by the Polish people. And we think maybe the rocks, they got the rocks from when they built the churches and the courthouse and everything. Anything that wasn't perfect, because if you look at the church, it's just perfect. The Polish people got the remnants, and a lot of the houses, even some of these huge rocks are huge, but they got nips in them or aren't perfect. And some of these houses have those rocks, and it's just beautiful. I think that we know that that's where they came from, and they came from the river. All right. The rock is the only original part. The two ends were porch. This was the front, and the front door, and it was right there, and we moved it over there because I didn't want them in my bedroom.
Many had fled anti-Polish oppression and wars waged by Prussia, only to encounter a new conflict just 10 years after their arrival, the American Civil War. Numerous Poles got conscripted into both opposing armies. The Reconstruction era, followed by the lawlessness of the Wild West, brought further hardship.
And what happened? Just less than 10 years after they got here, we had the American Civil War. And in the American Civil War, the people who came here, who were largely indentured servants back home in Europe, right? They were not generally the landed class. They were not part of the American South in a way that the rest of Texas, say east of the Colorado River, was, where you had plantations, where you had this agrarian society that was very much built on slavery.
Because Panna Maria people were pretty much still survivors on our own, and we had no slaves to begin with. In that regard, we were not really affected by any of that, except for the families whose sons got conscripted, and then they were suffering for laborers there.
And Texas joined the Confederacy, right? But these people in Panna Maria were not subscribed to the cause. And they had already developed this whole identity apart from everyone else in the county, who had largely been two groups of people. The Mexican people who were here before the border crossed them, and the American Southerners who had come down and immigrated to Texas as part of that Mexican immigration push that led to the Texas Revolution. And so the people in charge of the county, the group of government here, were largely the Southerners and organized the conscription. And so the people of Panna Maria were conscripted into the South.
Which is kind of ironic because that was one of the reasons they left Poland. And so the same thing happens to them here. The Polish people were not fighters, okay? And there's several stories of families that the gentlemen, they were captured on the first day of battle. But the Union Army let them go ahead and change sides instead of going to the prison camp, which kind of put them in a strange position because then they were fighting their own people. And the group from Panna Maria was called the Panna Maria Grays.
They were not fighting this war on the same basis as the people around them. They were more sympathetic to the Union. And so a number of them, including a great uncle of mine, escaped and went over to fight for the Union. And then got recaptured and got killed, but that's another story. But some of them, you know the story of Peter Kielbasa, right? Peter Kielbasa went on to be one of the leaders of the new wave of Polish people that came to Chicago and became the first Polish-American legislator in a way that would not have happened but for this history here.
He was big in Chicago. He was a big city administrator there, and very powerful man. I know at some point it was my great So it was Rufus's, my grandfather's father, and his name might have been Ignatz. Okay. He was one of 7 brothers. And he would have been born in the late 1880-ish, probably 1880s. He was one of 7 brothers. So there's a lot of kielbases in this part of the country.
At the heart of their community stood the church. Their shared faith helped them navigate the turbulence following the Civil War, a time marked by lawlessness and suspicion from neighbors. It was through this faith and unity that their culture and the language of their old country survived for decades.
Animosity that had developed between the Southerners, the Americans, and the Silesian people who had come to Panna Maria, the original 100 families, and then the add-ons like the Opielas, really insulated this community in a way that allowed it to not assimilate into the rest of America in the way that some of the other immigrant communities have. Because you know the story too about how they would ride in to Mass on Sunday and fire shotguns to harass people. This was something that I think is important. The church always has been the center of the community here. And the pastors in Panna Maria have always been from the whole old world. They were all from Silesia, okay? And so they always had this little bit of an activism separate from and apart from the rest of the world around them. Because of that isolation, that enabled the community to grow and preserve the Texas Silesian dialect in a way that just would not have happened, but for that set of circumstances, and led to, for instance, my father not learning English until he went to the public school here in Coy City. So when he went to the parochial school, and this is not too long ago, this is in the pre-war period, pre-World War II period, the nuns taught him in Polish, or it's the Texas Silesian dialect, which is almost Polish, right? And so they preserved that language and that culture into the 20th century in a way that is a very unique part of the identity here that would not have happened but for the entire story that's come before.
It made it harder for them to get incorporated out. And it wasn't until the in the 1950s or so that there was more of a integration within the group here. And Panna Maria always was centered around the church, even for myself, because there were dirt roads. We didn't live, let's say, in Panna Maria proper. We lived out on the farms. It wasn't until actually, other than one family that had moved in for a semester here in Panna Maria, it was all Polish kids and Catholic kids that we all came together. And so, we didn't have play dates or any of that kind of stuff. So going to church and meeting up with your friends was a big thing, and that's where you wanted to go. Because during the summertime, we were working the fields at home. So it really wasn't until I went into high school, which is down the road in Karn City, did I actually know anyone that was not Polish or not Catholic.
After World War II, that was the break. The break began when the parochial school turned into a public school in the 1950s, okay? And that school's still there and back at the church. They have the original school that was built in the oldest Polish school in America. That was actually my Eagle Scout project back when I was in high school, was cleaning it up and restoring it. But then they built the new public school. But the nuns still taught in the public school, but they taught in English, not in Polish, because you had to, as a government school, you have to teach the curriculum of the government, right? Which is, English is the American language.
A couple of things were happening. We were all Polish. That freshman year, we still kind of clung together as a group. But one of the things, too, that was important for us was the education. And so when we got to Karn City, to that school, we were at the top of the class. And out of the Panna Maria kids in my group that went, there was 12 of us that went. All 12 of us were National Honor Society. All 12 of us graduated here and we went on to college. So education was very important to us. So we were kind of the competition there for a while. You know, all the ones that were at the top of the class found out, okay, these people are coming in and they're pretty smart. Then after that freshman year, it was a lot easier because then you knew. But, you know, in my case particularly, there were already other Polish people over there laying the groundwork, so they knew what to expect. But that's not to say that there wasn't a rivalry, because there were many times fights on the Carnsteady Bridge over here that the Panna Maria boys didn't want one of the Carnsteady boys dating a Panna Maria girl. And so they would have fights out on the bridge over there. So a lot of that kind of thing was a lot of competition out on the athletic field, because our guys were throwing, you know, baling hay, doing real manual labor. So they were the best football players out there. So, you know, a lot of competition like that was going on. But that, you know, that's already in the 1960s, 50s, 60s, 70s. My dad actually went to school in this building, but he went through the 8th grade, and that's usually as far as the guys or the gentlemen went, because then they went to work on the farms.
The Poles helped build America. They fought for America. And over time, they became a part of America. But they never forgot the land they came from. From generation to generation, stories of the old motherland were passed on.
People said, "Father, what is Silesia? What is Śląsk, Silesia, that you have to cry for this? Why?" There was a neighbor lady, name was Emilia Lisse, and she said to me, "Because when my grandpa goes out and he's drunk, he cries." So I asked him, "Grandpa, why do you cry?" "Oh, Jocha, oh girl, if you knew what Silesia is, you would cry too."
The guy that made it big in terms of the church, Bishop John Yanta, okay, who really came into his own in the 1960s and 1970s and took this to another step by trying to build that actual relationship across the ocean, and sent the first group from Panna Maria to Poland in about, I think it was around the year I was born, in 1978.
Father Frank was the closest collaborator of John Yanta. Today, he continues the mission of his bishop. He believes the most meaningful work lies in building bridges between Texans and Polish Silesians.
Bishop Yanta came back when he retired. He said, "I want to do something for the people, the local people, and I have to also find a place to put my stuff, my papers, my homilies, my experience as a priest and the bishop to a place. And I have the money from the oil, so I can create something or build something." So I was around him at the time, and he said, "How do you want to call this?" I said, "If you think about the Blessed Mother, the Mother of Jesus, maybe we can call this Panna Maria Heritage Center."
Polish is no longer the first language spoken by Silesian Texans, but what still connects them to their ancestors and gives them strength is their faith.
Catholic, and to a large extent, bring that heritage. My identity as a Catholic is, to me, very much tied to my cultural identity in a way that I think a lot of people maybe don't have because of their differing backgrounds that they have. Maybe some do, maybe some don't. But I view my Catholic religious beliefs in the context and the lens of, frankly, I wouldn't be here but for being Catholic, right? Without Father Leopold Muchigamba, I would not exist, at least here, in the way that we as a community exist. It was very much driven by the Catholic Church and how the people that came from Upper Silesia are all very much Catholic or Lutheran. They're more German, right? But both of that, and I call Lutheran Catholic light to a large extent in this area. The Lutheran Church is very much Catholic in terms of the little c Catholic versus the big C Catholic. It's all a shared belief. And I can't divorce my faith from my history.
For many years, Silesian Texans made their living through hard work on ranches, raising cattle and growing cotton. When uranium and oil were discovered in Texas, everything changed. The new generation of Silesian Texans are professionals, yet they remain eager to connect with their ancestral homeland. Even in a changing world, they honor the legacy of those who came before them.
You can't ever tell this story from today going forward. You have to tell the story and the struggle that people had going as they marched, because that's what defines who they are. Who they are today is not defining who, for the economic circumstances they're in, being blessed the way we are today, is not defining who you are as you grow up, as you develop. It was the circumstances at the time that did that. And that's a point I wanted to make to you. That's why I found it so important to preserve that. Because if you don't have that history, how do you know the experiences that brought you to where you are today? You don't.